Good day. My name is Michael Molondo. I'm going to present on the subject of human rights, HIV/AIDS, HH30D4. And the purpose of this presentation is to prepare you for the upcoming exam. And this presentation is actually divided into two parts. The first part will be to give you a general understanding and knowledge about the exam, what you have to do to prepare yourself, and then also what you can be expected. Then I will also give you a presentation on when you are going to write the exam, the day of the examination, what you have to do and what you have to look at. The second part of the presentation will be based on the content of the subjects, where I'm going to explain to something. Now, just remember that the purpose of this presentation is not to give you just a certain scope of the exam, but just to prepare you. So you are still expected as a student to know the whole content of your subject, the whole subject itself, and preferably that you have to read the whole chapters in that book or in your study manual so that you can be ready for the examination. So the first part, as I say, is just some tips that I've gained over the years and also working with students. And this is just to prepare yourself what you might expect before the exam. Now, before the exam, I will advise that you must come up with a 2 months timetable. Now, the reason of having a timetable is just to prepare yourself. I have found that many students that when they're going to write exam, that a week before or a day before, that's when they want to start or to study a subject. Now, it's actually advisable that you have to be prepared in advance than putting yourself under pressure and then coming the day you're writing the exam and you're under a lot of pressure and there is no way that you will be able to write the exam. So if your subject is having, say, 10 units or 15 chapters or 11 chapters, I will suggest that you divide those chapters over a period of 2 months. If it's a 1 month, it's even fine, where you have like 2 to 3 chapters or units in a week, which you have to go through. And that will actually help you then to prepare or to be ready for any examination. Now, the first thing that you have to do is you have to read through your book or through your study manual. The purpose of reading is just to understand the content and the context of the subject, because many times that we try to memorize our work, and we don't understand the whole context of the subject itself. Because when you are going to write the exam, you are not just expected to answer the question, but also to give more than just the question. And having a holistic and a comprehensive understanding of what is expected from the specific subject will help you a lot. So my suggestion is for you just to read through these chapters, read through the units, just to have an understanding what the subject is all about. So read it from one chapter to the last chapter. Then the second thing what you have to do is taking notes. While you are reading through your chapters, you are preparing yourself. Take a pen, take a piece of paper or a book, or even you can write in your study manual. So while you are reading, you will discover there are some concepts, some keywords that you don't understand. So it will be very good if you underline those words, circle it, and make reference to your dictionary just to understand what those words mean, or even search in a library or on the internet. So it's very important, because making notes will help you that when you will do your revision, then it's easy to understand your own notes than to understand words that you don't even recognize, or it's difficult for you to explain. So after you've made your notes, then a week before the exam, sometimes 2 weeks, all depends, is then what we call a revision. And revision will help you a lot, because your brain is like a computer. It's having a hard drive. It's like a hard drive. You store all the information on your hard drive. So when you need the information, you just go to your internet, your folder, and then you retrieve the data. And this is how your mind is also working. So revision will actually help you then to just retrieve the data that you have gained over the period of a month or 2 months, and that's part of your revision. So preferably a week, 2 weeks before the examination, so that you can be ready for the examination itself. So now the day when you're going to write your exam, it's very important to note that you are sitting in this examination hall, you are having your script in front of you and your exam paper. So when you have your exam paper, there are four things that you have to do. The first thing is just to read through the 6 questions, or through all the questions that's on your question paper. Then the second thing what you have to do is you select the easiest question that you can answer. Experience have learned that if you start with the most difficult question, by the time you're going to answer or write your easiest question, then your time is very limited. So don't waste too much time with difficult questions. Rather have enough time to answer the question that you know very well. So that's the second thing. The third thing is, once you have selected your question or questions, then you first need to read, then you have to read the question again, just to understand what the question is all about. And then the fourth thing is, what you have to do is you have to answer that question. Don't interpret, don't assume that's what the question is all about. But what you have to do is you have to answer the question that's been asked. So that's with regard to the tips that I want to give you to prepare yourself for the examination, to make sure that you are ready. So now we're going to go to the second part of the subject itself, is to look at the scope of the examination, what you might expect. Now, these are only thematic areas or themes that might arise in the exam, but you are still encouraged to study the whole subject, to go through the whole study manual, even if you have to look at for additional resources like the internet, going to the library, just for you to have a comprehensive understanding and knowledge about the subject. Now, the first thing that you need to know is you need to have an understanding about basic human rights. Now, the subject itself is all about human rights. Now, many people, they've got different interpretation of human rights. Now, in the context of what you are studying, you have to understand that every person, every human being is having a right, and also with those rights also come responsibilities. So you have to look at human rights as a definition, as a word, as a concept. Then you have to look at human rights in the context of Namibia. How does human rights actually compare, or how is it being explained within the constitution of Namibia? Then you can look at other charters, you can look at other articles, you can look at international convention that has been signed and that's been ratified on human rights. It will be probably very good during this time when you're going to prepare yourself, is just to read through about the human rights, the different aspects, the challenges of human rights, and how these challenges has been overcome. Also look at human rights from a perspective of other countries. What were the best practices? You have to look at human rights from the perspective of Southern Africa, and then also, of course, you have to zoom in Namibia. What were the challenges? How was the implementation of human rights? And also, what are the lessons that we can learn looking at human rights per se? Then the second thing you have to do is you have to look human rights in the context of HIV/AIDS. What role does human rights play with people that are infected and affected with HIV/AIDS? So does it play a role, and what kind of role you have to play? You have to look at the synergy of human rights and HIV/AIDS, and how you can implement the principle of human rights when it comes, for example, to those, especially people living with HIV/AIDS. So you have to understand the context in what human rights is all about. So when you are going to look, then of course you're going to raise up the issue of stigma and discrimination discrimination, and how that is underscored or underlined or supported by basic principle of human rights. So especially people that are living openly with the disease are experiencing a lot of stigmatization especially at the workplace, a lot of discrimination. So discuss in detail, how do you compare, how does human rights play a role when it comes to HIV/AIDS? Now, the pandemic is having two sides or three sides. The first side is it's having the clinical side where people are actually need to use ARVs, especially those that are HIV positive. So how does human right, what role does human right play when it comes, for example, the use of ARV? And basic human rights demands that any person must have the accessibility, the availability and the support for ARVs. Then of course your biological, when it comes to nutrition, you're looking at your body itself. How can you be protected so that your body must not be abused? And then of course looking also at the legal aspect of those people living with the HIV virus. So human rights does play a pivotal role, and this is something that you have to discuss and then also to look at. Now, the other part of the subject is looking at minority groups. Now, minority groups play a very important role, and this is where many of the minority groups are actually being subjected to discrimination. And under the minority group, you also have what we call the high-risk groups. And the high-risk groups are, for example, these sex workers, we call prostitutes. We also have, for example, men that are having sex with men. We've got the gays, we've got the lesbians. We also have, for example, those that are having different sexual orientation. So they are in the minor. That's why the word says minor groups. So they are not the majority. So how does the Constitution or the law of the country respect and then also protect the rights of those that are actually being discriminated when it comes to the fight of HIV/AIDS. So there is international convention that has been ratified, even by Namibia itself, and this is where you have to look at the issue of the minority group. So there is so many things to discuss, but I will suggest that at this time you have to look also at what is in place and how this is being addressed. You can also at this stage also look at the experiences of other countries, but preferably sub-Saharan Africa. How are the issues of minority groups handled? You can look, for example, in South Africa. You can look at Botswana, Zambia, in the SADC region. How does minority group being involved and then also protected? So there is so much that you can write and you can also study about. So preferably is to focus specifically in developing countries like Namibia itself, and to share those experiences. And giving practical example will be very helpful. So you might get a question that's 20 marks, which is a long question, and it does not mean that you must only write a paragraph. It means you have to write at least 2 pages or 1.5 page on the subject that is concerned. The other thing is the Constitution of Namibia. Now, I've made a reference to it before. Article 95 of the Constitution, which actually protects the basic human rights of every Namibian. So you have to discuss that Article 95. You have to discuss what it says. What is the right of every citizen of Namibia? What right does the Constitution give you? And what privileges do you have with regard to your right as a Namibian? So the Constitution is the most powerful document that actually support and the basic rights of every Namibian. So you have to look at it, and I will encourage you that you have to study the Constitution and also look how does it work. And of course, the question is always what the Constitution say and what's happening in the practical. Does it make sense? For an example, so currently there is a lot of laws that are still in place that are very discriminatory. They actually discriminate minority groups. They discriminate other people with different sexual orientation. So how does the constitution of the country actually support the current norm that actually is a conflict or that contradicts the international convention on the protection of human rights? So this is something that you can also discuss in the exam, and you can look at different aspects. So you can also bring up the issue of the national policy on HIV/AIDS. You can also bring up the labor law. How does the labor law actually discuss the whole issue of the constitution? And then why the constitution? Because within the constitution there is a lot of areas that are actually linked to HIV/AIDS. And we've talked about it previously in my presentation. We've also talked about it, and it's also been presented in your study guide. So you have to compare and look at the Constitution and what role does it play to the protection of those living with HIV/AIDS. So it's very important that you look at it and that you also study in order to have a better understanding of what the Constitution is saying. Now, what do you do in a situation where somebody's rights is being violated, especially by those that are supposed to enforce the Constitution or the law of the country? So this is something that you have to look at. Now, there has been so many atrocities committed worldwide when it comes to the basic rights of children and then also adults. And many of these rights have never been heard. I mean, this violation have never been heard. But there is so much happening. And during this time, it will be very good if you can come up with practical examples and share what happened and what was the experiences of other countries when it comes to the in reinforcement of the legality or the legal frameworks. And you can also look at other legal frameworks, as I said before, the legal framework, like for an example, the UN conventions, the commitments that has been signed with regard to HIV/AIDS, issues on universal access, and so on. So the Constitution does have a support, or has a foundational right, or does display the foundational right of every human being, especially people living with HIV/AIDS in Namibia. So then, of course, then you will discuss HIV/AIDS itself. We have talked so many times about HIV/AIDS, and I think by now you have knowledge about what HIV and what AIDS is. And then you have to look at it in the light of children. And when I talk about children, you can also make reference to orphans and vulnerable children, the OVCs. What impact does HIV has on children? There are so many areas that you can actually touch, so many areas that you can discuss when it comes to children, and especially the International Convention of Children's Rights, or the Rights of Children, which protects the basic right of children. And this basic human right says that children do have the right to the access of services, and then also support services when it comes to their status. Now, because of the event or advent of the ARV and the availability of ARV, many children whose parents are positive and were actually born very healthy because of the ARV phenomenon that we have, availability that we have. So in your answer, in your question, discuss this whole aspect about children, the rights of children, how children are being impacted with HIV/AIDS, and what is in place. What does the government do to respond to the needs of children, as an example. Now, when we look at the evolution of HIV/AIDS from the late 1980s and where we are now in the 21st century, there are so many strides, so many results, so many progress that has been made when it comes to addressing the needs of children in the context of HIV/AIDS. Also, the issue of mother-to-child prevention to mother and to child, the elimination of mother-to-child, and so on. So you can discuss a lot. So there's so much to discuss, so much that you can actually cover when it comes to HIV and children. What do you do, for example, if children's rights are being violated, as I've mentioned earlier? So this is something that you can actually also discuss in detail, so that when you are going to write it, then you can have an holistic and a whole understanding of concept of the subject. Then the other thing is the HIV/AIDS education program. Now, this is where you have to look also is what programs are currently in place. Now, the reason of programs or education programs is as follows. The first thing why you have education programs is you want to raise awareness. The second thing what you want to do to raise education program, for example, is you want to empower people. The third reason why you have education program is because you want to, okay, it's part of empowerment is, for example, you want to change behavior. So you want to make sure that people will change their behavior and their practices with regard to their lifestyle. And then, of course, the whole purpose of education program, lastly, then is for policy and legal framework. So it's creating awareness, equipment, and empower to change behavior, and then also is you can also discuss the whole issue of policy. Now, policy is very important. It's something that is being neglected very much, especially in most countries. So then you can also discuss then secondly, how do you use HIV/AIDS education programs within the workplace? How do you empower employees when it comes to the awareness raising, to the behavior change, and then also on the policy formulation and development of workplace programs. So there's so much that you can discuss, so much that you can cover with regard to education program within the workplace and what role employees can play. So companies and organizations can make a change, and they can also make their employees as catalysts of change or agents of change. And this is what you have to discuss when you are going to implement an HIV education program in your workplace. What area are you going to look at? Where are you going to start? What will you do to ensure that there will be an impact? And then you can also look at other best practices in the country, lessons that you can learn when it comes to HIV/AIDS education programs and its employee. And then, of course, you're also going to look at HIV/AIDS education program in the youth or the young people, the adolescent. What program can you put in place, or what program is there for young people? And this is actually the basic right, human rights of every young person to have access to knowledge, understanding, so that they can be equipped to make to make the right decision. And it's very important that you need to discuss how does education program play a role when it comes to human rights of young people. Then, of course, you can also raise the charter or discuss the Namibian Charter on HIV/AIDS, what it entails. So you can also look into it. And then, of course, you have to look at what are the rights of people living with HIV/AIDS in the context of the subject of human rights. So I have come then to the end of my presentation, and I hope that this presentation helped you to prepare yourself for your examination, and I wish you all the best. Thank you.